Some childhood memories are precious, filled with innocence and joy, but others? They leave behind shadows that linger for years. These true treehouse horror stories will make you think twice before venturing into those seemingly safe havens of childhood. When I was 10, my family moved from a modest home in Pennsylvania to a luxurious property in Maryland. It wasn't just a move for us. It felt like stepping into an entirely different world. Our old neighborhood was quiet, but run down, a place where kids like me played with sticks in empty lots and where privacy felt like a luxury. The new house, however, was massive. Its sprawling yard, manicured hedges, and high-end interiors screamed a wealth and security we'd never known before. But the real gem, the treehouse. This wasn't an ordinary treehouse slapped together by a weekend hobbyist. It was a 3-story marvel that sprawled across 6 towering trees. With its spiral staircase, wooden railings, and interconnected platforms, it looked more like a child's castle in the sky than a simple playhouse. My brothers, Sean and Harold, were thrilled at first, and for weeks we spent every free moment climbing, running, and pretending to be kings, defending our fortress. But as older brothers often do, they grew bored. The allure of the treehouse faded for them as they turned their attention to video games and friends. For me, the treehouse became a sanctuary. I spent hours up there reading comics, sketching, or just watching the world go by. It was my escape, a place where I didn't have to share or explain myself to anyone. But one day the treehouse began to change, or rather something about it shifted, something I couldn't quite put into words at the time. It started with a note, folded neatly and left in the corner of the lowest platform. The paper seemed out of place among the scattered toys and crumpled wrappers my brothers and I often left behind. The note read, "Hello, I'm the Marshmallow Man. What's your name?" The handwriting was messy, like a child's, but the tone was polite and inviting. I remember laughing, assuming it was one of my brothers playing a prank. I grabbed a marker and a fresh piece of paper from the stash we kept up there and wrote back, "Hi, I'm Name. Nice to meet you." I left the note where I found the first one and went home, excited to see where the game would lead. The next day, there was another note. "What's your favorite game to play?" it asked. I wrote back again, enjoying the back and forth. For days, this continued, each note waiting for me in the same spot. The questions were simple, at first, the kind of things kids ask each other. What's your favorite color? Do you have any pets? But then they began to shift. Which window is your bedroom? What time do you usually go to bed? I didn't think much of it at the time. It seemed like harmless curiosity, the kind of questions a friend might ask. I answered honestly, excited to keep the game alive. But looking back, I can't believe how naive I was. The notes were growing more personal, more invasive, and I didn't even notice. Then came the night of the marshmallows. It started with a tapping sound at my bedroom window, soft and rhythmic. I thought it might be the wind or a stray branch brushing against the glass. But when I pulled back the curtains, I froze. Taped to the outside of the window were dozens of marshmallows, arranged in a perfect grid. My heart raced as I stared at them, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Had one of my brothers done this? Was this part of the game? If so, it wasn't funny anymore. The next morning, I confronted Sean and Harold, demanding to know who was behind the notes. They laughed at me, calling me crazy and insisting they had nothing to do with it. Their denial only made me angrier. If it wasn't them, then who? My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. That night, I decided to stay awake. I sat by my window, waiting for the tapping to start again. Hours passed, and my eyelids grew heavy, but I refused to let myself fall asleep. Just when I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. I whipped open the curtains, ready to catch my prankster in the act. But what I saw wasn't my brothers. It wasn't anyone I recognized. Standing outside my window, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a man. His skin was sickly pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed a haunting yellow. His smile revealed teeth that looked decayed and broken, as though they hadn't been cared for in decades. He waved at me, a slow, deliberate motion that sent chills down my spine. I screamed loud enough to wake the entire house. My parents burst into my room moments later, demanding to know what was wrong. But when I pointed to the window, the man was gone. The police were called, and they searched the property thoroughly, combing through the yard and even the treehouse. They found nothing. The days following the incident were filled with an eerie tension. My parents, though skeptical of what I had seen, insisted on doubling down on security. Motion lights were installed around the property, and the treehouse itself was boarded up. My sanctuary had become a symbol of fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that the Marshmallow Man was still watching. Every creak in the house, every rustle of the leaves outside, made my heart race. My nights were plagued with nightmares of his yellow eyes and decayed smile. I took to sleeping with the lights on, a habit that took years to break. Even as an adult, I find myself haunted by the memory. I've tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a neighbor or some drifter passing through, but no explanation feels sufficient. The notes, the marshmallows, the man himself, it all felt too deliberate, too targeted. Years later, when I visited my childhood home, I couldn't resist the urge to check on the treehouse. The boards had long since rotted away, and nature had begun to reclaim it. But as I stood beneath those towering trees, I felt the same chilling presence I had as a child. The Marshmallow Man may have disappeared, but his shadow lingers, etched into the fabric of my memory. It wasn't until recently, after hearing similar accounts from others online, that I began to piece together a theory. Could the Marshmallow Man be a manifestation of something older, a being tied to the woods, feeding off the fear of children? It's impossible to say, but the thought keeps me awake at night. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, leaving notes in some other child's sanctuary. Late at night, when I scroll through forums discussing unexplained childhood events, I've found other stories eerily similar to mine. Different names, different settings, but the same disturbing patterns. Anonymous notes, strange figures in the dark, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. It's chilling to think that my experience might not have been unique. One particular thread described a man with glowing eyes seen near an abandoned treehouse. The poster claimed that the figure left behind objects like small toys or sweets as gifts. Others chimed in, sharing their own encounters with entities that seemed to thrive on fear and isolation. These accounts only deepen the mystery and leave me wondering, who or what is the Marshmallow Man? If this story sent chills down your spine, hit the like button and share it with your friends. Let's dive deeper into the shadows of these haunting tales. When I first built the treehouse for my son Luke, it was supposed to be a symbol of creativity and fun. At 8 years old, he was a ball of energy, always climbing trees and coming up with elaborate stories. My wife, Christy, had her doubts about the project. She'd cross her arms and say, It's too high. What if he falls? But I reassured her, promising the treehouse would be sturdy and safe, a place where Luke's imagination could run wild. The treehouse was more than just a project for me. It was a labor of love. I spent weeks cutting wood, measuring beams, and carefully constructing the walls and roof. By the time it was finished, it had become something more than I had planned. With its proper stairs, small windows, and sturdy railings, it looked like a miniature house nestled high in the trees. When Luke saw it for the first time, his face lit up in pure joy. At first, everything was perfect. Luke invited his friends over almost every weekend. The sound of their laughter echoed through the yard as they climbed the ladder and made the treehouse their fortress. It felt good to see Luke so happy. But then, little by little, things began to change. Luke started spending more and more time in the treehouse alone. He'd head out there after school and wouldn't come back until dinner. Christy noticed it too. "He's been awfully quiet lately," she said one evening as we cleared the table. "Maybe he's just growing up," I replied, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Then came the day Luke mentioned Jake. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Luke had just come back inside after hours in the treehouse. I asked him what he'd been up to, and he casually said, "Playing with Jake." "Who's Jake?" I asked, assuming it was one of the neighborhood kids. "He's my friend," Luke said, not looking up from his plate of mac and cheese. "He lives in the treehouse." Christy smiled, thinking it was just a sign of Luke's active imagination. "An imaginary friend, huh?" she said. But something about the way Luke said it gave me pause. He wasn't the kind of kid to make up imaginary friends. He'd always been practical, preferring real-life adventures to make-believe ones. I decided not to push it and let the subject drop. But from that day forward, Jake became a regular topic of conversation. At first, Luke's stories about Jake seemed harmless enough. Jake liked to play hide and seek. Jake loved peanut butter sandwiches. Jake thought the treehouse was the best place in the world. But as the weeks went on, the stories grew stranger. Luke claimed Jake didn't like to come down from the treehouse. "He says it's safer up there," Luke told me one night as I tucked him into bed. When I asked why, Luke just shrugged and said, "He doesn't like the people who live in the woods." I tried to laugh it off. "What people?" I asked. Luke's expression turned serious. "The ones with the black eyes. Jake says they're bad." That night, I found it hard to sleep. Christy was already snoring softly beside me, but my mind kept wandering back to Luke's words. Who were these people with black eyes? And why was Jake so afraid of them? The next morning, I decided to check out the treehouse for myself. I hadn't been up there in weeks, and I wanted to make sure everything was still in good shape. As I climbed the ladder, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The treehouse, once a place of joy and laughter, now felt off. Inside, I found the usual signs of Luke's play: scattered toys, a few crumpled papers, and an empty juice box. But there was something else too. In the far corner of the treehouse, carved into the wooden floor, were strange markings. They looked like symbols, though I couldn't make sense of them. They weren't there the last time I'd been up here, and I doubted Luke had done it himself. The carvings were too intricate, too deliberate. I called Luke over and asked him about the markings. "Oh, those are Jake's," he said matter-of-factly. "He made them so the bad people can't come inside." I didn't know how to respond. Christy brushed it off as childhood imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Over the next few days, I started noticing other strange things. Luke began waking up in the middle of the night, crying and claiming he'd heard whispers outside his window. Once, I found muddy footprints leading from the base of the tree to the edge of the yard, though Luke swore he hadn't been outside. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the backyard. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when the tapping grew louder and more insistent, I knew I had to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The yard was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. As I approached the treehouse, the tapping stopped. I shone my flashlight up into the branches, half expecting to see Luke peeking out at me. But the treehouse was empty. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something on the ladder. Taped to one of the rungs was a piece of paper. My heart pounded as I unfolded it. The message was written in a child's scrawl, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "Stay away. He's watching." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by Luke's bed, watching over him as he slept. The next morning, I showed Christy the note, but she dismissed it as a prank. "Kids can be weird," she said, but I wasn't so sure. Over the next few weeks, the tension in our house grew. Luke's stories about Jake became darker. He claimed Jake had warned him about the people with black eyes coming closer. Luke even refused to go outside, saying he could feel them watching from the woods. The breaking point came one night when Luke woke up screaming. He said he'd seen someone standing outside his window. When I rushed to check, I found nothing, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the ground below the window. It was a single black feather, glossy and unnaturally large. I decided it was time to take action. The next day I dismantled the treehouse, piece by piece. Luke cried, begging me to stop, but I couldn't take any more chances. As I removed the final plank, I found another note, this one carved into the wood. "You can't keep him safe forever." To this day, I don't know who or what Jake really was. All I know is that after the treehouse came down, the whispers stopped, and the feeling of being watched faded. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint tapping of branches against the window, and I wonder if Jake's warnings were meant for someone else. Do you think Jake was protecting Luke, or could he have been something more sinister? Share your theories in the comments. When I returned to my parents' home for fall break during my sophomore year of college, I wasn't expecting much beyond the usual routine. Home-cooked meals, catching up with old friends, and enduring the overbearing love of my family. It was a brief respite from the chaos of California, where I attended school, and I planned to make the most of my few days of peace. But what I encountered instead was something far from peaceful, something that still makes my skin crawl. My childhood home was a quaint suburban house in Delaware, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The backyard was dominated by a towering oak tree that had stood there long before the house was built. My dad had constructed a tree house in that oak when I was about 7, a simple platform with wooden railings and a rope ladder. Over the years, the tree house had fallen into disrepair, but it still stood, weathered and creaky, like a relic of my childhood. When I arrived home, the first thing I noticed was how quiet the neighborhood felt. It was the kind of silence that seemed unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I dismissed the thought, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. After all, I was here to relax, not to dwell on eerie feelings. That evening, my parents went out to a charity banquet, leaving me alone in the house. I relished the solitude and decided to revisit the treehouse, a nostalgic trip down memory lane. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way to the backyard. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of decaying leaves, and the treehouse loomed above me like a ghost from my past. Climbing the ladder felt strange, as if I were crossing a threshold into another world. The wood creaked under my weight, and the flashlight beam revealed cobwebs and weathered planks. Yet, despite its age, the treehouse felt sturdy enough to hold me. As I sat there, looking out over the yard, I felt an odd sense of unease. The treehouse had always been a place of comfort, a refuge from the worries of the world, but now it felt different. The shadows beneath the tree seemed darker, the rustling of the leaves more ominous. I shook off the feeling and chalked it up to the eerie charm of being alone at night. The peace didn't last long. As I sat there, lost in thought, I noticed movement in the yard below. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a stray cat. But as I focused my flashlight, the beam illuminated a figure. My breath caught in my throat. It was a person. The figure was standing near the base of the tree, motionless, staring up at the treehouse. They were dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by shadows. I froze, unsure of what to do. My flashlight's beam wavered as my hands began to tremble. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response. The figure didn't move. Panic set in. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a neighbor? A prankster? Or something far worse? I decided to climb down and confront them, hoping to scare them off. But as I descended the ladder, the figure moved. They darted into the woods at the edge of the yard, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, flashlight sweeping the trees, but they were gone. My heart was pounding, and every instinct told me to go back inside. I locked all the doors and spent the rest of the evening on edge, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The next morning I told my parents about what had happened. My dad brushed it off as a Halloween prank, even though it was weeks past October. My mom was more concerned, but ultimately agreed it was probably nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, the real terror began. Around midnight, I was lying in bed when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like knuckles rapping against glass. My stomach dropped as I realized it was coming from my window. Slowly, I turned my head, and there it was, a face staring back at me. The figure from the yard was now inches away, separated only by a pane of glass. Their face was pale, almost ghostly, and their eyes were wide and unblinking. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, they raised a hand and tapped the glass again, sending a jolt of terror through me. I scrambled out of bed and ran to my parents' room, yelling for them to wake up. My dad grabbed a baseball bat and stormed outside, but by the time we got to the yard, the figure was gone. The only evidence of their presence was a set of footprints in the dirt beneath my window. The police were called, and they searched the area, but they found nothing. They suggested it might have been a prowler, someone looking for an easy target. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just some random trespasser. Whoever it was, they had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The rest of my time at home was a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I avoided the treehouse entirely, unwilling to go near it again. Even after I returned to California, the memory of that face haunted me. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, and double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. Months later, my parents called to tell me they had torn down the treehouse. "It's just too old and dangerous now, my dear boy." Enjoy, Gustad said, but I knew the real reason. They'd seen the fear in my eyes and decided it wasn't worth keeping around. To this day, I don't know who or what the figure was. Was it just a person playing a cruel prank? Or was it something darker, something that had been watching me for years? All I know is that the watcher in the trees left a mark on me that I'll never forget. If this story gave you chills, make sure to subscribe for more terrifying tales. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story.